But the first thing I wanted to share is that last Friday morning, I talked to our NSF program manager um, for a couple of reasons. One, just to make sure that everything was okay because we just put through the subcontract for Lori. But I also had never really talked to him. And so I wanted to hear what he thought about the programs and what he would count as a win for a project like this, because they have to sell their types of programs up the ladder too. And so I figured I wouldn't know what he thought. And especially I wanted to know what he would think of as a win for an interdisciplinary project. And I usually think of what would be cool as we all work together, we integrate in ways that we might not have imagined. We're not working separately, and so we demonstrate good integration. And that is actually not what I heard. So what I heard was, I asked him what was a win, and the hey Ellie, I'm just sharing outcomes from my conversation with our program manager, and then we'll get to your bits in just a minute. But I think this is relevant to you too. So he said, well, it's hard to say, but I have some examples. And the three examples that he gave, every one of them was just how a project eventually had some kind of impact, like somebody was using the results in the world. He did not seem to care about how good we are at integration across the team, but he is interested in integration in that it might help you do something that you could not have done just as engineers. And so it still felt to me like a very engineering definition, like, yeah, it's more functional, you know. So I thought that was really interesting. We had a pretty wide-ranging conversation, but I think those are the 2 points that I thought were relevant to the project. And so, oh, and another point that was relevant is he's actually interested in what we're doing because a long time ago, he thought of it himself for a different reason. He was thinking about how pressurization is used for clean rooms, and he came home and said, what if we could just pressurize the house and keep the dust out? And so when he saw our thing, he's like, oh, I thought of that. It must be a good idea. Anyway, so that's what I have to report from that. And I'm glad I spoke with him. He was a interesting person. So Ali Hoher is did I say your name right? Hoher is here. Ali, it works at CSU Strata, and that is what we call our technology transfer program, or I'm going to let you introduce it, Ali. I'm going to make a hash of it. I've got a few collected thoughts on slides, Ali, but I'm going to let you go first. Tell the folks what you do, and then maybe use the slides to just start some discussion, but then in general, let the team ask you and you advise us.
Sure, that sounds good. So yeah, my name's Ali Hoher. I work for CSU Strata. CSU Strata is technically separate from Colorado State University. We are the research foundation. We only serve the university though, so we work for you. We do a bunch of things, but one of the things we do is what's called technology transfer. That's the office that I'm in. What technology transfer is, it's a fancy way of saying that we manage intellectual property for the university. So there's researchers, there's students, there's new ideas coming out, and for a long time, it's been known that there's a lot of research and ideas being developed at universities, and for a long time they were kind of stuck. And so the question was, how do we get them out of the university and how do we get them into people's hands? And so that's part of what offices like mine were built to do. Most major institutions in the country have an office like mine. When something new is developed or discovered or created, they tell us about it. And then we look into, can we patent it? Can we copyright it? Is there a trademark? And then we look into, do people want this? Is this something that can be commercialized? Is there a partner? Can we find a partner? And can we make that happen? Do we build a company around it? All of those fun different things. And so that's, in a nutshell, the short version of kind of who we are and what we do.
Awesome. And I will also say that the past couple years, Ali has spoken to our REU students, so that's a really interesting portion of their education. So is it okay if I share some slides just to give you quickly the context and what you might be interested in? And I developed these on my own just to create some talking points, and I'm sure the team would like to add to that, so that may happen along the way. So the context is that outdoor pollution is a source of health risk. I'm sure you've seen work from other people around the university on air pollution, and that's one of the greatest environmental risks. Traditional air sources have been decreasing emissions, but then wildfires are increasing and particulate matter is increasing. I think anyone who lives in this area, I don't need to convince of that. And so I think one of the principles here is there's still going to be outdoor air pollution that we can't control and that we may want to respond to. And so this project has a lot of pieces, and I'm happy to dive into them, but I think the overview is to minimize concentrations of indoor air pollutants in houses, which are really complex systems that are affected by not only the built environment, but the natural environment, the users, the technology we use, and then how we can get that technology into homes, which we call provisioning systems. So pollutants originate outdoors and come in, pollutants originate indoors and can be trapped. To date, most systems have been designed to get indoor pollutants out, but not to worry about indoor or outdoor pollutants coming in. So that's what we're working on, and it requires that we understand a lot of these pieces. How does the built environment work? How does the natural environment affect what's inside? And then how do the users behave, or how are they likely to behave in operating technology to reduce the indoor concentrations? So I'm going to throw out some things. I put 4 things on the next slide that might be considered innovations. And I put them kind of in order of how far along we are on them, but all of these are being worked on in this project. So Christian Lorange is sensing outdoor rising pollution. So using sensors and algorithms to identify that the house might need to be treated. So of course it costs to run an intervention, and so you only want to do it when you have to. So that's one thing. We are working on a potential solution to pressurize the home with filtered clean air to keep dirty air out. So this concept has already been used in clean rooms, and then there's some systems that already use makeup air to provide some conditioning. Hasn't been used for the whole house. And then along with that, there could be some feedback, which we are working on prediction, which also isn't well developed for houses. So using pressure measurements and a predictive model to estimate exactly how much clean air you have to provide, because you could of course force a huge amount of air in, but then you'd have to condition all of it, and that would be costly. So there's that. I did a bad job with the user interface, Erica, but tailoring notifications to the users for the greatest reduction in human exposure. So the house is going to sense something, and it might tell the user to turn on an intervention. It might do it automatically, but figuring out exactly how that would work. And then finally, there's a cost benefit algorithm that we have barely begun to think about. But again, the intervention costs. Some people like things running, some people don't. And then some people have more sensitive health conditions where they would tolerate a lower concentration than other people. And so being able to balance those and allowing people to tweak their own priorities for the system would be something else. So those are the things that I have called out. I've got a couple of questions later. Maybe Paul, I don't know if Christian is here yet. Yep, Christian's on. Erica, maybe you folks could expand on this if I've missed anything or you'd like to clarify something for Ali.
I can do a quick one. Can you hear me okay? I haven't been able to get my computer to work.
You're audible.
Okay, good. Now I think that covers the main pieces. I think when it comes down to, if we went forward with a full disclosure, there's some pieces we can expand on there, but I think you've covered the broad space that the innovation would cover. I think the only piece that I'm not sure is in here yet, and I apologize, I hopped in late, so maybe it was, is I do think these sort of pieces could actually be valuable from a data collection standpoint as well. So innovation in terms of how we learn how people live in their homes could get layered on top of this as well. That's not necessarily explicitly in what you have right now.
That's fair. Anyone else want to comment?
So I'll ask a question. I see algorithms, I see methods. Are there any new devices that are gonna be created to make all of this happen? Physical objects?
Yeah, so we've been doing some hardware development, which is kind of integrating of existing core technologies into a package to do these pieces.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I guess it depends on how you define new devices. Everything I think is used in some way somewhere else. It's the application, the kind of assemblage and then application that I think of as not being done.
Yeah, it's definitely an integration type of problem that we're tackling as opposed to a fundamental new widget.
And I have a hard time answering that yes or no, because Paul, you've pointed out that the pressurization has been used in other ways, but then it's not at that flow rate or it's not right. So where do you start calling it new? I'm not sure. I think Allie, you're probably the expert there.
And that would be a question that we would have to dig into more than probably on this call. There's hardware that needs to adapt, so that's what I needed to know. But sometimes you put two pieces of hardware together and it's not enough of an innovation to be patentable, and sometimes it is. There's a camera and there was a phone, and we put those together and it became a camera phone, and that was patentable even though those two things already existed. But sometimes that's not enough. So it's a case by case, and I'd probably need to know more, which we don't need to probably get into those details for this conversation. Just knowing that there is hardware is enough.
Erica, did you want to say anything about what you might have to offer? Because I feel like I did a particularly bad job summarizing yours.
No, and I'm not sure if any of it is like innovative, right? I struggle with how it would be within the CSU Strata realm, right? We're just making a user interface, right? So like touchscreen display that they would interact with. I don't think there's too much novelty in that.
The only one I would add there, though, is the touchscreen is not innovative, but I haven't seen anything that gives a user any sort of dial to control their own air pollution. Kind of in an informed way, right? Filtration on, off. So I do think you could make a case from what the dashboard is doing and the user interfaces is like empowering people to control their own air pollution exposure.
Okay.
Yeah, that was well said. Thanks, Christian.
And so, Ollie, I'll state my bias. I have in the past been very much I don't want to make money out of this. Let's get it let's just benefit the greatest number of people possible. And so this is me trying to overcome my bias and to bring you in as a partner and as a thought partner. because I think you and your office have ways of thinking about impact that we may not be familiar with, and we could probably benefit from hearing from you. We do have specific questions, especially about disclosure, because we're kind of early in this process. And I think what I heard from you when I listened to you with the REU students is just tell us, right? Talk to us early. And so that's what we're doing. And so here's my questions. And I'm grateful for other people to jump in. When should we talk to you? What should we do if we think there's a potential innovation? And how much should we avoid? What should we avoid disclosing? And then this is the kind of thing in a complex system where we want input. And so how do we do that without risking the so-called wrong kind of disclosure?
So to speak to the impact first, before I get into the specific questions, I see what we do as another venue for making impact. There's publications, and publications reach an academic group really easily. But companies, sometimes they can't access them unless you've got it open access. They don't pay for journal articles. Usually they don't have any of that ability. So unless they're talking to you, or they are talking to somebody who's talking to you, or they're talking to another academic who knows your work, they might not know that this has been created. And so us trying to talk to them is trying to get the word out further. Some of them also, they won't take something from a university because it needs a lot more development before it can be sold. And unless there's a patent that gives them exclusive access to use it commercially, they're not going to put that development into it. So there are things that the best way to get them out there to a large group of people is to publish them. And we think that's great, and we encourage that. And there are things that won't reach as much of an audience as they potentially could without some sort of intellectual property and licensing. And so that's what we're trying to help bridge that gap for. When you should talk to us, this is great. Early, love early. We know that things happen, and sometimes you have a presentation tomorrow that you're like, oh shoot, there's maybe something valuable here. And so we do that, but whenever we have chance to kind of talk to you and work through it and discuss these exact questions, and so that we're not in a panic trying to do something at the last moment, is always fabulous. Public disclosures are important for something that's maybe going to be patented. Something that's copywritten or a trademark, doesn't really matter. The reason for that is a public disclosure starts what's called the patent clock. And let me first talk about what a public disclosure is. So if you're talking about your invention, your idea, in a way that somebody else could go and recreate it, somebody else that has a relative skill level as you, and they could go and take what you've said and go do it themselves, that's a public disclosure. It doesn't matter if they actually do take it and go do it themselves. If you've given the information for them to do that, that's called a public disclosure. If you have a public disclosure before filing a patent application, there are countries that you will not get a patent in, notably all of Europe. The US has what's called a grace period. So if you have a public disclosure, and then you have up to a year to file a patent application. And so when possible, we try to file patent applications before public disclosures to potentially maintain all the rights, including those in foreign countries. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes we decide that we're only interested in the US anyway, so it's okay. But we always like to hedge on the side of caution. But again, this matters for patents. So patents are devices, they're methods, they're compositions of matter. So new chemicals, new devices, and a method of doing something. You talked about algorithms. Algorithm is in a mathematical formula, like the Pythagorean theorem, is not projectable in any way. It's considered a fact. Plain math on its own, a squared plus b squared plus c squared, is just a fact, and we can't protect that. But a software using an algorithm is protectable. Software we protect typically with copyright, because it's a written material, it falls under copyright. Sometimes we will file a patent. If we file a patent, it would be on the method behind the software. The software is enacting a certain series of steps, and that would be what we would try to protect. The question is that method going to be anticipated to change? And if so, when? When we file a patent, a full patent application, that's fixed. That's not changeable. We can't adjust that. And then it will take on average 2 to 3 years before we know whether that patent has been granted. So is that method for that software going to stay the same and not change for a very long period of time? And if the answer is yes, then we go, okay, maybe we'll consider a patent. If the answer is no, it's probably going to change, then we will just stick with copyright. And we don't have to worry about a public disclosure for copyright. And so we can have that specific conversation in specific instances of what do we think the evolution of this is going to be. Sometimes with copyright, we'll talk about when people want to talk about it and disclose it, we'll do what's called pseudocode, where you type what the code is doing in essence, but not what the code is. The only potential concern is that copyright protects your code as it is, but then doesn't protect the method behind it. So if somebody knows what that method is and what you're doing, they can go write their own code that does it, and they're not in violation. So that's our pluses and minuses and benefits. NDAs and CDAs, which are essentially the same thing, they're confidentiality agreements, protect against something being a public disclosure. So if there's a particular company that you want to work with, then it can be good to have that in place before sharing details that would make them be able to go do it themselves. Otherwise, you keep it at a high level of a conversation of kind of what you just did with me of we're going to do this, we are accomplishing this. The example I give a lot is with chemistry of I have made this recyclable polymer and I haven't told you all of the steps of the equation that were the chemical equation needed to make that polymer, just that I've made the polymer and these are the properties. So I tell you the end result, not how we got there, the secret sauce.
Maybe I can respond quickly about the algorithm piece. I'm guessing it's not going to be something that's a protectable piece, just based on how I think we've done it so far. There's a lot of hard work and skill into getting it to work, but I think there's probably little novel from the method beyond how it would be applied within the bigger ecosystem of stuff we're talking about. That's my guess, at least from some of our previous conversations about similar type overlaps between hardware and software. That'd be my guess about where it's falling.
And I think one of my questions, Ali, I don't know how others feel, but I have, I'm personally more concerned about other people patenting out from under you or taking your and using it in ways not saying this well. So I think one thing to know is this project is currently focused on benefiting low income housing.
Sure.
And so we're not going for the luxury market here. And maybe that would be a concern, is how do you ensure that you continue to reach the markets that you have targeted, and that the technology and ideas continue to benefit or continue to be able to benefit those individuals.
Yeah, that's getting to the harder questions related to finding that kind of development and commercialization partner. And sometimes you have a technology that it just isn't attractive to the people that you don't want, so that's the easiest case. The problem case is when it's attractive to multiple parties. And the unfortunate somewhat reality is that if you're up against a very large company with a lot of money, they have a lot of money and they have a lot of resources. And at the very minimum, they'll probably, if they think there's enough value to it, build their own workaround. And you try to file patents that are as broad as possible so that you can prevent people from doing that. We don't focus as much on people beating you to filing. We are in a first to file system now. This is true. And so if you actively knew that someone else was working to solve the same problem and you believed they were doing roughly the same or a very similar thing to you, then that would be something that we would want to talk about and take into consideration for planning the timeline of when we're filing. But the sooner we have to file, the sooner we have to start making hard decisions. The first thing we would file is what's called a provisional patent application. That lasts for 12 months. At 12 months, we have two options. One is to convert to a full patent application in essence. And the other one is, well, three options. The other one is to file a new provisional application. We can't extend. So what we would have to do is we would have to get rid of that date that we had on that first one and essentially be starting over with a new date. We can only do that if there hasn't been a public disclosure that's of concern. And then the third thing is to give up on it entirely. And there's a lot of things that from the time we file that first provisional to the time that that 12-month period ends, we haven't had the progress we need to justify the expense of the full patent application. And sometimes that's because the inventors are on to another project and their interest is gone. Sometimes it's because just the science hasn't worked out. And sometimes it's because we've tried and we can't find a partner that's interested, or we've gotten feedback that this isn't of interest specifically. Because full patent applications cost on average to start between $10,000 and $15,000. And that's a cost that our office is taking on. You are very welcome. And so we want to plan timelines so that we're ahead of public disclosures, but that we also have enough time to get work done to validate things in order to make those hard decisions, if that makes sense.
Okay, it makes sense. And I don't think I'm terrifically worried. I think and I don't know how the group feels. I'm not speaking for everyone. What I would like to do is, in general, knowing our interest is to do good science to benefit a segment of the population that needs it. We don't want to be stupid. And so I'm just saying we're here to ask you to help keep us from being stupid. I don't know how, if anyone else feels differently on this.
I feel like if this is going to have the impact that we want it to have, we're going to have to get it into somebody else's hands. We're going to have to make
For
it
sure.
possible for people who do this kind of thing better, we're gonna have to get it to them. And so I would like to have kind of the fewest barriers to that possible. And, but I guess one of the concerns is somebody who isn't going to do a good job with it managed to lay claim to it because we didn't, then nobody ever gets it.
Well, and
Yeah.
here's a question for you. If we've protected this and it's, you know, there's no concerns about the IP, all of that is buttoned down, it's ours, we're good. But the only person we can find that wants to work with us is a high-end developer rather than someone serving that community that you're interested in. How would you feel about that? Because in an ideal world, we'd have a bunch of people that we could work with, but the fact of the matter is we usually are lucky if we can find one. So that's something to think of too, is anybody better than nobody, or is it, and we're gonna know it's absolutely gonna be these people. And this is not a stake that I have in the game, because I don't, if you tell me I really hate to work with these people, I don't like doing things that you don't want to do. It's not a good relationship builder for us. So, but that's something to think about as well.
Say most plausible people are better than nobody. There are probably a couple where I would be very reluctant.
I think that's a great way to frame it though, Ally. Right, we don't have to answer that question right now, but if that is the outcome, then that tells us something about what the market really is. So. Interesting. I just. Does everyone feel like they understand the rules around disclosure of what? Because I think this is why we brought it forward now, that we're thinking of doing a session to get feedback at a national conference. So I'm curious whether people think they have enough information to understand that.
And I guess I'll add, I'm not trying to tell you you can't disclose. You're academics, you have to publish, you have to present. We want you to do that. But if we're in a situation where public disclosure needs to happen, we just want to be able to assess it and try to protect it first. That's all.
So I'm not hearing anything. It sounds like maybe if we get in that situation, we should run something by you now that we've had this conversation. And preferably before the night before we're gonna present it.
Sometimes, you know, if it's a poster or a talk and the timeline doesn't make sense, we try to make it non-disclosing. Or sometimes we'll decide to file. If we decide to file, we need what's called an invention disclosure filed with our system. It's a document. We ask for a title, an abstract, information about the inventors, information about the funding. Those are kind of the big things along with the public disclosure, but obviously in that case, we'd be knowing what that is, because that'd be the reason we started the conversation. It asks some other questions, but they're optional. You don't have to fill them out. I'm not that worried about them. Those are the kind of big things we need.
And then Christian, you spoke about feeling like your work was maybe not protectable, and yet yours is the farthest along and I think there may be a large number of potential applications for it. I'm curious how you, or if you want to ask anything here about where that might go, or how that makes it into the world, or whether it does. You want to share anything about that?
I don't see him on the call anymore.
Oh, yeah, maybe his computer wasn't working. Okay.
I interpreted his question though, or his comment more as it may not be patentable, but that doesn't mean it's not protectable through copyright. Copyright is a lot easier. We don't have to worry about public disclosure. It doesn't
Yeah.
cost $15,000 to file.
Yeah, so and then if it changes, you just refile a new copyright? Is
You
that
don't
how?
even need to file, it's automatic. As soon as the code is written, there's a copyright that exists on it. We only file in pretty rare cases when we believe we're going to be pursuing, going after someone from infringement and doing so in federal court. That's when you need to have copyright filed, and you can file at any point.
That's
There's
so interesting, okay. Cause so much innovation now is sort of algorithmic, or the way you implement within software.
yes.
And it's totally different from patenting.
Another big difference to consider, patents have inventors. And inventors are the people who came up with the ideas, who had this would be a good idea to do this. Copyright has authors. Authors are the people who physically created it. They physically wrote the code. So if I had the idea and I instructed a student to go write code, if we filed a patent on the method behind that code, I would be the inventor. The student would not be, because they didn't come up with any ideas. However, the copyright for that code would be fully the student as the author. I would have no part in the copyright ownership because I didn't write any of the code.
That's super interesting too. Okay, does anyone else want to ask anything? Been calling on people, but there's probably a bunch of people who may be
Did you have
interested.
a slide of questions too?
I had another slide that's totally separate, and it may not even be you, so I left it over for if it's time.
No worries.
Do have a question, and if somebody says this is premature, let's put this off till later, that's fine. Let's say we decided that the hardware side had enough innovation to be patentable, and so we went through this process to protect it. How difficult is it? And what are there things that we really need to be thinking about to have a good commercial partner start to run with it?
So we get about 100 inventions a year. Last year, we did about 30 licenses. Some of those licenses were for the same technology to multiple people. So that starts to give you a little bit of an idea about numbers of like the number of things that don't make it. I work with everything in physical sciences at the university. So problems that are needed to validate commercially vary across disciplines. In some disciplines, scalability is a big issue, particularly in chemistry, the ability, but in all fields to an extent, the ability to take it from making one or a small version to a big version, or what would be the financial variation between making one in a lab and making 10 million to sell. So those kind of economics are things companies think of and look at. But the biggest thing is that we run into with research is that we have a solution to a problem that people don't have the problem. And so getting validation from, and sometimes not even just the customer, but a company that their customers are asking for it. Because I've had projects where I know that there's a customer asking for it. A customer wants it, but the customer is not telling the company that they work with that they want it. Therefore, the company is not going to license it from us because they don't know that their customers want it. So that kind of confusion mix-up happens sometimes. And I've had that with a couple kind of manufactured materials or variations in products that are being produced for consumers, that the consumers don't know it could exist to ask for it. And so the companies don't see a need to create it.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
but if-
maybe, I wonder if we should have a more in-depth conversation about this, because I think, sorry, Paul, you can go ahead, because you may be going where I was gonna go.
No, I mean, I could pursue it further right now, but I'm not sure that is the best use of our remaining 6 minutes. And so perhaps a follow-up at an appropriate time would be better.
Yeah.
Happy to-
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, because I think you're probably talking about one specific thing, and I wanted this to be more of a group should know this from Ally, and group should know about Ally.
Mhm.
As I was designing the hardware, I came across similar products, and my initial reaction was, oh my gosh, this is the same thing we're building. We have slight variations, but how far off or how many additions do we need to make to not be duplicating something that already exists? And how would we go about, like, because the two products in particular, one from Panasonic, are pretty darn similar.
So there's two kind of answers to that on two different levels. One is the commercial level and one is the patentable level. The commercial level is if you're not infringing on somebody's patent and you can get it to sell, then you're fine. The patent level though, patents care about usefulness. In order to patent something, it needs to be useful, it needs to be novel, and it needs to be non-obvious. Useful means it does something, anything, pretty low bar to meet. Novel means it is in some way different. Nobody has done this exact same thing. If somebody has done almost the exact same thing, but you've changed it just a little bit, that is different. It's technically novel. But then the non-obvious is where that tiny variation matters. Was that variation big enough to be an inventive step? And that's what we get into most arguments with the patent office about. In terms of, we've added this piece. What did that piece bring to the table? The examiner is probably going to say, well, the piece was out there and this thing was out there, and so would have made sense to put it together. But if somebody out there in the literature that we can reference said you wouldn't put them together, but we made it happen, then we have an argument for non-obvious. There's also a, why hasn't somebody done this before? Is it because this piece is in biology and veterinary medicine, and we've taken that and turned it into air quality, and those two are groups that would not know about the same thing and know to overlap? That's an argument. And so it's really preparing the argument, and that's something we do as well, and why we try to get time before a public disclosure so we can look at what your invention is and what other people have patented and see if we think we have enough room to get a patent that is also valuable. Because you can get a patent on a lot of things, but that are so narrow and specific that somebody could very easily get around it. So can we patent something that is going to have value, that if somebody is going to want to pay us for that?
Very nice. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, ours is unique in the sense that we like read pressure and react to pressure. So, but there are fresh air supplies out there, like many of them. So that's good to hear.
Yeah. Okay, if nobody has anything else, thank you so much for joining us, Ally, and for taking the time to walk through everything really clearly.
Thanks for having me. I know I dumped a lot of information, so if there's some point where you're like, I can't remember what she said, I'm here.
That's why we recorded it. Hey, everyone, have a great weekend.